أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. I seek refuge with Allah against the accursed enemy in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum. Today we have a special broadcast that I've chosen to call a one-on-one conversation with my community. And let me note that for today's special presentation, I consider anyone who wants peace through justice for all of the inhabitants of the world a part of my community. We want to welcome our friends and guests in South Africa, the United States, and around the world to this week's edition of a conversation with El-Hajj Mauri Saalakhan. I am pleased to be your host, coming to you once again through the Salam Media platform out of Johannesburg, South Africa. Salam Media is an online portal for humanitarian journalism. We don't just report the news, we advise you on what you can do about it. For today's broadcast, I have no guests. I'm coming to you one-on-one with a fact-based analysis of the 2020 Republican Convention. You know, initially I wanted this presentation to be an overview of both the Democratic and Republican conventions that just took place back to back. The Republican convention took place this past week. The Democratic convention took place the week before that. And while I want to do an analysis on both, it occurred to me as I was preparing the outline for today's program that would be impossible for me to do justice. So with that being the case, I'm going to make just a very brief comment on the Democratic Convention and spend most of our time on the Republican Convention because this is the party that represents the man in the Oval Office right now, in what has been a rather unprecedented presidency, to say the least. The Democratic Convention came off fairly well. One of the major disappointments for me, though I was not surprised, given where we are as a nation, really being torn apart by all kinds of fissures, religious, racial, quote unquote, political. I wasn't surprised that on the main stage of the Democratic Convention, there was not one Muslim representative, not one. You know, there were some sidebar forums that took place within the convention, you know, but where, you know, Muslims were heavily represented, but on the main stage of the Democratic Convention, there was no representation. With the exception of, at the very end, in the interfaith sign-off, there was a member of the Jewish community, a member of the Christian community, and Imam Talib Abdul Rashid out of New York represented in his closing benediction the Muslim community. That was the only voice that was heard from Muslims in the entire convention, unfortunately. With that said, it represents, in my humble opinion, a major challenge for the Muslims within the Democratic Party, and especially the Muslim operatives, the Muslim functionaries at different levels of the Democratic organization, the Muslim political activists in different parts of the country that were a part of the convention, who argue the importance of Muslims having a seat at the table. This is a major challenge for those of you who have been making that argument that there has to be more substance from the Muslim presence. There has to be more than just selective opportunities for, facial recognition at the table. With that said, I'm going to go right to the Republican convention. And before I begin the sharing of this criticism that I'm going to share from the Washington Post, that did a fact-based analysis of the major speeches, beginning, of course, with the president's foremost. Some of the really outrageous violations of truth that took place. I want to share that with you because it speaks to the challenge that confronts us all in this country as a nation. And my decision to share this analysis, this fact-based analysis, provided to us by analysts from the Washington Post, is something that I'm sure will be appreciated by our brothers and sisters in South Africa, because I think it was Brother Ponte who shared with me that because of the hour that the convention took place and the time difference between the United States and South Africa, our brothers and sisters over there were not able to follow the convention as closely as many of them would have wanted to. I'm sure the hardcore junkies were up in the middle of the night, trying to catch what they could, but the vast majority of folk did not. And so I'm sure that you will appreciate what I'm going to share from this analysis that was done, because it will also provide you with an overview of some of the issues that were discussed in the Republican National Convention. Many of the same issues were addressed within the Democratic National Convention, and these will be the issues that will be argued over in the days ahead, between now and Election Day in the first week of November, roughly 2 months from now. Let me begin with an observation that was made by my dear brother, Dr. Cornel West, who was with us just a few weeks ago on this Salam Media platform for a conversation. In an interview that he had with one of the major networks, he made this observation. He said, "We are witnessing America as a failed social experiment," quote unquote. We are witnessing America as a failed social experiment. And when I saw that, when I read that observation that he made, because I didn't see the interview, when I read that observation, I said to myself, "Wow, this is a reflection of so many things that we should take to heart, both here in America and abroad, because of the enormous footprint that the United States of America has on the world. It has a tremendous amount of influence around the globe." Thomas Jefferson said, "We have the greatest opportunity the world has ever seen as long as we remain honest, which will be as long as we keep the attention of our people alive. If they once become inattentive to public affairs, you and I, Congress and assemblies, judges and governors would all become wolves, quote unquote. That's a very profound observation. And I'd like to go from there to an observation made by one of our very enlightened sisters from another faith community, Arundhati Roy, an extraordinary Indian woman of tremendous intellect. She said the battle has to begin here in America. This was a speech that she delivered on one of her visits to the United States. She said the battle has to begin here in America. The only institution more powerful than the US government is American civil society. That's a very insightful observation she made here. She went on to say the rest of us are subjects of slave nations. We are by no means powerless, but you have the power of proximity. You have access to the imperial palace and the emperor's chambers. Empire's conquests are being carried out in your name, end quote. Powerful observation. And so true. Again, against the backdrop of that observation, against the backdrop of what Jefferson warned of, as Dr. Cornel West noted, we are witnessing in real time, right here and now, America as a failed social experiment. I'm also reminded of the words of Sheikh Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, who said, civilization is based on justice and the consequences of oppression are devastating. Therefore, it is said Allah aids the just state, even if it is non-Muslim, and withholds his help from the oppressive state, even if it is Muslim. And then generations later, that observation of cause and effect, the principle of cause and effect, not just on individuals, but on nations, was echoed by Jefferson in another observation he made in a letter he wrote to a very close friend. I imagine this letter was written in the wee hours of the night when everything was quiet and still, and he was all alone with his conscience and with his own contradictions, and with the contradictions that he witnessed in early America. He said, I tremble for my country. When I reflect, God is just. His justice cannot sleep forever. With that said, with that as the foundation laid for this presentation we're about to do, let me share with you the fact-checking report on President Trump's acceptance speech at the GOP convention courtesy of the Washington Post newspaper. And this special report was authored, according to the information I have in front of me, by Glenn Kessler, Salvador Rizzo, and Meg Kelly. It was published on August 28th at 8:09 in the morning. President Trump ended the Republican National Convention on Thursday with a tidal wave of tall tales, false claims, and revisionist history. Here are 25 claims by the president that caught our attention, along with 7 claims by speakers earlier in the evening. As is our practice, we do not award Pinocchios, the long nose symbol of blatant lies, for a roundup of claims made in convention events. Quote number 1 from President Trump, from his speech. America has tested more for the novel coronavirus than every country in Europe put together, and more than every nation in the Western Hemisphere combined. We have conducted 40 million more tests than the next closest nation, end quote. Now, the truth. Trump is talking about raw numbers, which is misleading. And if you believe China, Beijing actually exceeds the number of tests, 90 million to 79 million for the United States. The key indicator is tests per capita, which gives a read on the share of the population that has contracted the novel coronavirus that causes the disease COVID-19. The United States still lags major countries such as Russia and is tied with Britain in terms of number of tests per million people. Another problem is test results are slow in the United States. Test results for the novel coronavirus are taking so long to come back that experts say the results across the United States are often proving useless in the campaign to control the deadly disease. The Washington Post reported in July. The long testing turnaround times are making it impossible for the United States to replicate the central strategy used by other countries to effectively contain the virus: test, trace, and isolate. Pinocchio number 2. When I took bold action to issue a travel ban on China, Trump says, very early indeed. Joe Biden called it hysterical and xenophobic. And then I introduced a ban on Europe very early again. If we had listened to Joe, hundreds of thousands more Americans would have died, end quote. The Post. Trump oversells in the impact of his travel ban and on Biden's criticism. On January 31st, the president announced that effective February 2nd, non-US citizens were barred from traveling from China, but there were 11 exceptions. Meanwhile, US citizens and permanent residents could still travel from China, but were subject to screening and a possible 14-day quarantine. Trump's action did not take place in a vacuum. Many airlines were canceling flights, and by our count, at least 38 countries took similar action before or at the same time the US restrictions were put in place. The president said he took bold action that was criticized. News reports say he was reluctant to impose the ban, citing his relationship with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. But the action was urged by his top health advisors. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar told reporters on February 7th, quote, the travel restrictions that we put in place in consultation with the president were very measured and incremental. These were the uniform recommendations of the career public officials, health officials here at HHS, end quote. Any criticism was scattered and relatively muted. Trump points to a comment by former Vice President Biden, quote, this is no time for Donald Trump's record of hysteria and xenophobia and fear-mongering to lead the way instead of science, end quote. But Biden says that did not refer to the travel restrictions. The virus was already spreading through the United States, and there is little evidence that travel restrictions on China saved lives, especially because the Trump administration did not rapidly set up an effective testing regimen, as did many other countries. Trump also touts his restrictions on travel from some countries in Europe as effective. But a Washington Post examination found that his abrupt decision led to one final viral infusion before the country was forced to shut down. Quote, The lapses surrounding the spread from Europe stand alongside other breakdowns in developing diagnostic tests, securing protective gear, and imposing social distancing guidelines as reasons the United States became so overwhelmed, end quote. The Post also reported, quote, the travel mayhem was triggered by many of the same problems that plagued the U.S. response to the pandemic from the outset. Early warnings were missed or ignored. Coordination was chaotic or non-existent. Key agencies fumbled their assignments. Trump's errant statements undermined his administration's plans and endangered the public, end quote. Next, Trump said, the United States has among the lowest case fatality rates of any major country in the world, end quote. Response, this is false. Case fatality measures how many people known to have gotten COVID-19 eventually die of COVID-19, and the US rate is currently 3.1%. Johns Hopkins University says that puts the United States 11th among the 20 countries most affected by the disease. The United States ranks 4th for deaths per 100,000 population. Trump's phrasing appears to turn on the phrase, quote, major country. Among members of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, for instance, the US rate is lower than the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Spain, but higher than Australia, Japan, South Korea, Turkey, Latvia, the Czech Republic, and Israel, among others. Next, Trump said, I have done more for the African American community than any president since Abraham Lincoln, our first Republican president, end quote. Response, Trump appears to base this assertion on pre-coronavirus employment figures and some relatively minor actions taken during his administration. Historians say this claim is ridiculous. Trump has taken few actions specifically on behalf of African Americans. Lincoln freed the enslaved people in the Confederacy and pressed for passage of constitutional amendments to give them equal status under the law. Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which also had lasting impact on the lives of African Americans. These legislative victories were not easy, requiring Johnson to build coalitions with moderate Republicans and liberal Democrats to defeat the powerful segregationists in his own party who dominated the South. Trump is never one to be modest, but this kind of bragging is simply ridiculous. Now, after that correction, in brackets, there is another correction that they make of themselves, where they say, quote, we wrote moderate Republicans, but, quote unquote, moderate Republicans, but former Representative Tom Davis, a Republican from Virginia, contacted the Fact Center to note that many conservative Republicans also voted for the Civil Rights Bill and the cloture vote that broke a filibuster by conservative Democrats. Without these conservatives, the bill and cloture would not have happened, he said. The final vote for the bill was 73-27, with 27 Republicans in favor and just 6 opposed. Among Democrats, 46 voted for the bill and 21 rejected it. Moving right along. Trump stated, our NATO partners, as an example, were far behind in their defense payments. But at my strong urging, they agreed to pay $130 billion more a year, the first time in over 20 years that they upped their payments. And this $130 billion will ultimately go to $400 billion. Secretary General Stoltenberg, who heads NATO, was amazed and said that President Trump did what no one else was able to do, end quote. The Post. Throughout the 2016 campaign and his presidency, Trump has demonstrated that he has little notion of how NATO is funded and operates. He repeatedly claimed that other members of the alliance owed money to the United States and that they were delinquent in their payments. Then he claimed credit for the money pouring in as a result of his jawboning, even though much of the increase in these countries' contributions had been set under guidelines arranged during the Obama administration. Since 2006, NATO guidelines have asked each member country to spend at least 2% of its gross domestic product on defense. In 2014, NATO decided to increase its spending in response to Russia's seizure of Ukraine's Crimea region, with the goal of reaching 2% in each country by 2024. This money does not end up in NATO's coffers, as Trump often asserts. Direct funding for military-related operations, maintenance, and headquarters activity is based on gross national income, the total domestic and foreign output claimed by residents of a country, and is adjusted regularly. Trump's $130 billion figure comes from a NATO estimate that its European members and Canada will spend $130 billion additionally on defense over the 4 years between 2016 and 2020. The $130 billion is an estimate for cumulative defense spending through 2020 in 2015 dollars as an increase over 2016 spending. Trump falsely claims this is $130 billion a year rather than over 4 years. The $400 billion figure is for 8 years, but NATO figures show that the defense expenditures for NATO countries other than the United States have been going up in a consistent slope since 2014. As we noted, that's when NATO decided to boost spending in response to Russia's seizure of Ukraine's Crimea region. With Trump suggesting at times that he would consider withdrawing the United States from the alliance, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg clearly understands that it is necessary to play to Trump's ego. At a 2019 NATO summit, he thanked Trump for his leadership on defense spending. Stoltenberg, when he's not speaking in front of Trump, says 2019 was the, quote, 5th consecutive year of growth for European NATO members and Canada. That again takes us back to 2014. Trump. We will always and very strongly protect patients with pre-existing conditions. And that is a pledge from the entire Republican Party, end quote. The Post response is, this could hardly be more false. And we've given Trump's claim our worst rating, a bottomless Pinocchio. Trump took office and immediately began trying to dismantle the Affordable Care Act. And now his administration is asking the Supreme Court to strike down the entire law, including the pre-existing conditions coverage guarantee. Trump has not offered a replacement plan, despite promising one since days before taking office in 2017. We have also given 4 Pinocchios to several Republican senators, who have consistently worked to undermine the Affordable Care Act and its coverage guarantee, and who support the GOP lawsuit pending before the Supreme Court. The Republican Party has spent 10 years trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act and its coverage guarantee for patients with pre-existing conditions. But GOP lawmakers have never come to an agreement on how to replace the law. Next, Joe Biden, the party he leads, supports the extreme late-term abortion of defenseless babies right up until the moment of birth, stopping a baby's beating heart in the 9th month of pregnancy. The response. Most abortions are performed in the earlier stages of pregnancy. About 1% happen after the fetus reaches the point of viability. Trump and anti-abortion advocates have claimed for months that Biden or other Democrats support abortion up until the moment of birth, a claim that we have awarded 3 Pinocchios. They argue that some laws and court decisions have opened loopholes that allow abortions to the very end of a pregnancy. Experts have told us abortions up to the moment of birth, what could be described as infanticide, are not happening in the United States. Biden supports abortion rights and says he would codify in statute the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Roe versus Wade and related precedents, which generally limit abortions to the first 20 to 24 weeks of gestation. Other candidates for the Democratic presidential nomination, such as Senators Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, have said they favor no restrictions on abortion. But both co-sponsor the Women's Health Protection Act, which prohibits states from banning abortion before the fetus reaches viability. The Roe and Planned Parenthood versus Casey framework. And let me say, before going to the next statement of Trump, that as a committed Muslim, and I have stated this before, I am opposed to abortion as a form of birth control. I'm opposed to it. I have no problem with abortion where the life of a mother is at risk, and or in cases of rape or incest. I have no problem with abortion under those circumstances. But abortion as a form of birth control, which is what we have in the United States and other Western countries throughout the world, and in many of the developing nations, it's being pushed on them through Planned Parenthood's international agenda. SubhanAllah, I, as a committed Muslim, I am against that. And I also have noted in the past that, I see a fundamental hypocrisy when it comes to this issue on both the Democratic and Republican side of the political aisle in the United States. There are fundamental contradictions and hypocrisies coming from both parties and their most extreme advocates around this issue of abortion and the so-called right to choose versus the right to life. Next, we have spent nearly $2.5 trillion on completely rebuilding our military, which was very badly depleted when I took office. Another Trump statement in his speech. The response from the Post, false. The military was not depleted, despite Trump's insistence. The claim appears 175 times in our Trump database of false or misleading claims. The U.S. military budget had declined in the years before Trump took office as a result of decreases in funding for overseas contingency operations, as both the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan came to a close, not because the military was very badly depleted. And let me just say, in my humble opinion, based upon the facts, the reality is still before us. Those wars have not yet come to a close. People are still being killed in those theaters in the name of Americanism. Adjusted for inflation, the U.S. military budget under Trump lags some years during the height of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Over 3 fiscal years, the Trump administration and Congress have authorized $2.5 trillion in military spending. But the money is not all spent. Only a portion of it is destined for new equipment, and the equipment is not all built. Next, Trump said, I then approved the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines, ended the unfair and costly Paris Climate Accord, and secured for the first time American energy independence, quote unquote. Response: Trump signed executive orders to speed up construction of the Keystone XL pipeline, which the Obama administration had rejected. It still has not been built. But Trump did not approve the Dakota Access pipeline, which began construction during the Obama administration. The Paris Climate Accord allows member nations to set their own targets, and Trump could have unilaterally changed the commitments offered by the Obama administration. Trump and his allies often repeat the false claim that the United States is now energy independent. The United States is not energy independent, as it continues to import millions of barrels of oil per day. In 2019, the United States imported about 9.10 million barrels per day of petroleum from nearly 90 countries, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. The United States is expected to become a net energy exporter this year, according to the EIA, meaning it would sell more than it buys from other countries for the first time since 1952. That milestone apparently is not enough for Trump and his Republican supporters, who instead falsely claim the United States no longer relies on foreign energy. Next, Trump said, they spied on my campaign and they got caught. Response: Trump has concocted conspiracy theories about the Obama administration spying on his campaign, which he sometimes labels Obamagate. It started with Trump's false claim in 2017 that President Barack Obama ordered a wiretap on him. Then that merged with a report that an FBI informant in Europe, a professor named Stephen Halper, met with at least 3 people working on the Trump campaign in Europe. A former campaign aide, Carter Page, was subject to an FBI warrant. Lately, Trump has focused on a January 2017 meeting that Obama held in the Oval Office with then FBI Director James B. Comey, Vice President Joe Biden, and National Security Advisor Susan E. Rice, among others. Rice indicated in an email that Obama was primarily concerned with whether limits should be placed on classified information that was shared with the incoming team, in particular, incoming National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, in light of the intercepts of the calls between Flynn and the Russian ambassador. And I should note here parenthetically that Flynn ended up being prosecuted, successfully prosecuted, for breaking the law, for violating national security, and then Trump pardoned him. Getting back, although presidents generally are expected not to inquire about criminal investigations, it is appropriate to have a discussion about a counterintelligence probe, as that involves national security. Somehow, without much explanation, Trump has turned this meeting into a high crime that he considers to be treason. Next, during their conversation, during their convention, Trump says, Joe Biden and his supporters remain completely silent about the rioters and criminals spreading mayhem in Democratic-run cities, end quote. Response, inserting the phrase during their convention does not make this claim less misleading. Trump leaves out that in a video posted on Twitter on Wednesday, Biden condemned the violence in Wisconsin, where protests began after the police shooting of Jacob Blake. Blake, who is black, was shot 7 times in the back as he entered his car on Sunday and was paralyzed. A white teenager was arrested this week in connection with the deaths of 2 protesters. Quote, protesting brutality is a right and absolutely necessary, Biden said in the Twitter video. But burning down communities is not protest. It's needless violence, violence that endangers lives, end quote. And I agree. I agree with that. And that's one of the reasons why I had been advising for some time, my Muslim brothers and sisters, especially young Muslims who are entering into this fray, this turmoil for the first time as young activists, legitimately concerned about where this country is and the changes that need to be made. Yes, you should. I support you taking it to the streets and protesting, voicing your indignation, your opposition to the way things are. But please, don't protest at night. The night belongs to Shaitan. And that's where we find, many of the most destructive outrages taking place, lives being lost. Generally, more often than not, is happening at night. And you have these operatives that are among the demonstrators who are actually working for the other side. These operatives who are provocateurs. Don't demonstrate at night, brothers and sisters. You can do enough very effective demonstration during the day. Getting back, Trump said, when asked if he supports cutting police funding, Joe Biden replied, yes, absolutely. Response, this is a false claim that has earned Trump 4 Pinocchios. Biden does not support defunding police, according to the candidate and the campaign. The phrase generally means shrinking the scope of police responsibilities to public safety and changing the tactics used by police officers. It also means giving the police less money and putting more of that money that has been going to the police, more and more each year, in local budgets, state budgets, federal budgets, giving more of that to agencies to deal with the factors, the contributing factors to, that open the door to criminality and instability in our communities. Biden backs advocates' calls to increase spending on social programs separate from local police budgets, but he also wants more funding for police reform, such as body cameras and training on community policing approaches. And of course, those of us who are concerned about police budgets and are concerned about the need to reduce those budgets, we disagree with this position of Biden, but that's just one of many positions that we disagree with. Biden says, quote, no, I don't support defunding the police. He told CBS, I support conditioning federal aid to police based on whether or not they meet certain basic standards of decency and honorableness, and in fact are able to demonstrate they can protect the community and everybody in the community. end quote. Biden, in fact, has come under fire from the left for his position on proposing to spend an additional $300 million a year on the community policing program started in the Clinton administration. And I am among those who are in opposition to that. Trump citation of yes, absolutely draws a quote from an interview, is drawn from a quote from an interview Biden had with activist Adi Barkan, and an edited version posted by Now This on July 8th. During the interview, Barkan said, quote, "We can reduce the responsibilities assigned to the police and redirect some of the funding for police into social services, mental health counseling, and affordable housing." He asked Biden, "Are you open to that kind of reform?" In the video, Biden replies, "I've proposed that kind of reform." At another point, Barkan again asks, "But so we agree that we can redirect some of that funding?" The video shows Biden saying, "Yes, absolutely." But the audio tape of the full conversation on police shows Biden's responses were much more nuanced. The Now This video does not include Biden adding that his response was not the same as, quote, defunding all the police, end quote. He also speaks about increasing funding for mental health, which is different from saying we should fund mental health aid out of redirected funds from the police. In effect, Biden says he would condition aid on police reforms as an incentive on the one hand, while simultaneously providing additional resources for mental health, homelessness, and other kinds of community support. Next, Trump said the Biden-Bernie manifesto calls for abolishing cash bail, immediately releasing 400,000 criminals onto the streets and into your neighborhoods, end quote. Response: this is all wrong. Defendants awaiting trial have not been released in states that have moved to abolish cash bail. For example, in New Jersey, former Governor Chris Christie, a Republican allied with Trump, led a coalition to abolish cash bail and replace it with a point-based system that assesses risk based on the nature of the charges, the defendant's prior record, and the risk to the public. The Unity Task Force for Biden and Senator Bernie Sanders simply says, quote, poverty is not a crime and should not be treated as one. Democrats support eliminating the use of cash bail and believe no one should be imprisoned merely for failing to pay fines or fees, end quote. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. That's the same argument Chris Christie would make. Next, Trump says the Biden plan, he's even talking about taking the wall down. How about that? False. Biden has stated in no uncertain terms that he would not take down the portions of the border fencing system Trump has built, although he would stop further construction. Quote, there will not be another foot of wall constructed on my administration, Biden told NPR this month. Next, Trump says Biden has promised to abolish the production of American oil, coal, shale, and natural gas, laying waste to the economies of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Colorado, and New Mexico, end quote. False. Biden would not abolish fossil fuels. His plan on energy and the environment calls for net zero carbon emissions no later than 2050, quote unquote. That's 30 years from now. In the interim, Biden's plan says we must look at all low and zero, all low and zero carbon technologies, leaving the door open to carbon capture and other fossil fuel-based sources. That net zero language is a term of art, meaning that some fossil fuels would continue to be used so long as their emissions are offset by other means. Biden also says he would allow existing fracking operations to continue, but would not grant new permits on federal lands. Next, Trump stated Biden, pledged to increase refugee admissions by 700%. End quote. And this is an issue that really tugs at my heart. It's one of the things that really weighs on me. It weighs on me, brothers and sisters, every day. And this one of the reasons why, despite the distaste I have for Biden, and I have expressed this on a number of occasions in the past and outlined the reasons why, despite the strong distaste that I have for him, and despite my criticism of the Democratic Party, I recognize that there needs to be a change in administration to stop the social, economic, and political hemorrhaging that this nation is going through. And one of the examples of this is the refugee population and the separation of families, the children in cages, the children torn away from their mothers, the mothers who may never get their children back in their possession again, whether they are allowed to remain in the United States, whether they get refugee status in this country or are forced to leave. They will never see their children again because of the way that they were separated and the lack of accounting of which child belonged to which mother or which father. SubhanAllah. This is something that weighs on my heart in the heaviest of ways. Again, Biden, pledged to increase refugee admissions by 700%. The response: it's more accurate to say that the Trump administration has imposed new restrictions on asylum claims, and Biden would lift them. Obama had a ceiling of admitting 130,000 refugees a year. Trump slashed that figure to 18,000, from 130,000 to 18,000 refugees a year. And Biden would seek to increase it to 125,000. The Biden immigration page says he would reverse Trump's additional restrictions on asylum seekers traveling through Mexico or Guatemala, would not prosecute asylum seekers for misdemeanor illegal entry, and would undo attempts to prevent victims of gang and domestic violence from receiving asylum, among other changes. The Trump administration pioneered a program known as Remain in Mexico, or the Migrant Protection Protocols, MPP, under which mostly Central American migrants petitioning for asylum in the United States wait in Mexico while their U.S. immigration cases are pending. Democrats and migrant advocates say the arrangement exposes those asylum seekers to danger, which is not allowed under international laws covering refugees. Biden's website says he would end the MPP initiative and, quote, restore our asylum laws so that they do what they should be designed to do: protect people fleeing persecution and who cannot return home safely, end quote. Biden also pledged to increase the number of asylum officers to process applications faster. He said, quote, migrants who qualify for an asylum claim will be admitted to the country through an orderly process and connected with resources that will help them care for themselves, end quote. The Biden website says. He also says migrants who do not qualify will have the opportunity to make their claim before an immigration judge. But if they are unable to satisfy the court, the government will help facilitate their successful reintegration into their home countries, end quote. The Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force similarly says, quote, Democrats will end Trump administration policies that deny protected entry to asylum seekers. It adds, we will end prosecution of asylum seekers at the border and policies that force them to apply from safe third countries, which are far from safe. Next, Biden opposed the mission to take out Osama bin Laden. Response, we recently gave 3 Pinocchios to Biden, which he claimed he didn't tell Obama not to launch the bin Laden raid. But the story is a bit more complicated than Trump suggests. According to the accounts of administration officials involved in the internal debate, Biden was one of the 2 main skeptics of the intelligence, suggesting that bin Laden was in Abbottabad, Pakistan. He publicly even stated that he said don't go until more intelligence was gathered. So it's clear he advised Obama not to go at that moment when Obama's advisors were debating the issue. Biden, in an interview with CBS, claimed he did not say don't go, but instead had said try one more thing. He argued that since Obama had not made a final decision, he did not want to be on record in front of other administration officials as urging the mission. Quote, we walked up to the Oval. I said, Mr. President, follow your instincts. I know you should do it, but follow your instincts. Antony Blinken, a former Deputy Secretary of State who in 2011 was Biden's top foreign policy advisor, told the fact checker that he had learned of the private conversation between Obama and Biden shortly after it happened. Biden had argued in the Situation Room meeting for taking more time to get positive identification of bin Laden. But in the private conversation with Obama, Biden said, follow your instincts. They are always good, according to Blinken's recollection. Blinken is a campaign advisor to Biden. So it appears that there was a second conversation between Obama and Biden after the Situation Room meeting, in which he urged the president to follow his instincts. Whether Biden delivered a firm go message or Obama heard one remains unconfirmed. Next, Trump says he voted for the Iraq war. Now, this is really a doozy here. Response, Biden did vote to authorize an invasion of Iraq, which starting in 2005, he said was a mistake. Let me say for the record that Biden was a cold-blooded Democratic hawk as a senator in Congress, in the US Senate. He was a cold-blooded hawk when it came to all kinds of wars, all kinds of military conflicts and invasions. But Trump never mentions he was also a supporter of the Iraq War. Since he started running for president, Trump has claimed he opposed the invasion, but this is one of his signature lies. We searched high and low, as did other reporters, and there was no evidence Trump was an opponent of the March 2003 invasion of Iraq, let alone a vocal one. In fact, he offered lukewarm support. When radio host Howard Stern asked whether he supported invading Iraq, Trump replied, yeah, I guess so. You know, I wish the first time it was done correctly. In another interview on Fox News 2 months before the invasion, he said, President George W. Bush had to make a decision. Either you attack or you don't attack. Shortly after the invasion, he again told Fox News, it looks like a tremendous success from a military standpoint, quote unquote. Not until August 2004, in an interview with Esquire, did Trump publicly express opposition to the war. By then, 17 months after the invasion, many Americans had turned against it, making Trump's position not unique. Next, rather than spending $1 billion on a new building as planned, we took an already owned existing building in a better location and opened it at a cost of less than $500,000, Trump said. He's referring here to the U.S. Embassy in Israel, occupied Palestine. Response: the new U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem is a temporary location. It's not a new building. The United States refurbished its existing consulate in Jerusalem for about $400,000, but U.S. government documents show the overall cost for the conversion now totals more than $23 million. Cost for the permanent embassy could well surpass $1 billion when all is said and done. I just noticed here that we are at the 3 o'clock hour. I want to say to my my dear brother engineer, Brother Sadiq in South Africa, that send me a message, my brother, if we can just go a few minutes over. If we need to, I can continue this through another means, inshallah ta'ala. I don't want to. I know it's getting late in South Africa. I don't want to, and you're on public transport, so I don't want to hold you up, brother. So just give me a sign that if I can just go a few minutes more, inshallah ta'ala. Let me go to this next one. Earlier this year, I ended the NAFTA nightmare and signed the brand new U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement into law. Now, auto companies and others are building their plants and factories in America, not firing their employees and deserting us, Trump. Response: Trump regularly attacks North American Free Trade Agreement. He regularly attacks the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, which took effect in January of 1994 as the worst trade deal ever. He frequently describes it in apocalyptic terms, claiming it resulted in a loss of millions of jobs. NAFTA, which created an economically integrated market for the United States, Mexico, and Canada, has had strong critics from the start, and I have been among them. And it's difficult to separate the impact of trade agreements on jobs from other broader economic trends such as automation and the explosive growth of low-wage labor abroad. But Trump's attacks on the deal were over the top. Quote, in reality, NAFTA did not cause the huge job losses feared by the critics or the large economic gains predicted by supporters, concluded the nonpartisan Congressional Research Service in 2017. Again, quote, the net overall effect of NAFTA on the U.S. economy appears to have been relatively modest, primarily because trade with Canada and Mexico accounts for a small percentage of U.S. GDP. However, there were worker and firm adjustment costs as the three countries adjusted to more open trade and investment, end quote. As for the USMCA, it does make changes to modernize trade rules in effect from 1994 to 2020, and it gives some wins to U.S. farmers and blue-collar workers in the auto sector. Economists and auto experts think the USMCA is going to cause car prices in the United States to rise and the selection to go down. Some elements of the deal were borrowed from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade deal Trump scrapped at the start of his term. About 85 to 90% of the new deal is the same as the old deal. Quote, the bottom line is Trump didn't burn up NAFTA, wrote our colleague Heather Long. He made some modest tweaks. The U.S. International Trade Commission, which is tasked with evaluating the impact of trade agreements, calculated the New Deal would have a relatively minor impact. The USMCA would raise U.S. real costs, domestic product by $68.2 billion or 0.35%, and U.S. employment by 176,000 jobs or 0.12%. The report actually said USMCA will cause growth to decline by 0.12%, but then made some assumptions about investment and an end of policy uncertainty to achieve positive growth. Some analysts found those assumptions dubious. Brothers and sisters, it is now 3:06, and I didn't see a response from the engineer in South Africa. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this to a close. Inshallah ta'ala, I'm going to bring this to a close now. And I am going to continue this in a Facebook Live presentation from where I left off. I'm going to continue it in a Facebook Live presentation as soon as I end this, inshallah ta'ala, and so that we can go through the entirety of what the contradictions with. Okay, I just got word from the brother I can carry on, so okay, we'll continue it. Trump said in a new term as president, we will again build the greatest economy in history. This is what he said. The response, although this claim has been repeated every night of the Republican convention, the president still did not preside over the strongest economy in U.S. history. Before the coronavirus pandemic shuttered businesses and sent unemployment soaring, the president could certainly brag about the state of the economy in his first 3 years as president. But he ran into trouble when he made a play for the history books by repeatedly touting it as the best economy ever. By just about any important measure, the economy under Trump did not do as well as it did under Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower, Lyndon B. Johnson, or Bill Clinton. The gross domestic product grew at an annual rate of 2.3% in 2019, slipping from 2.9% in 2018 and 2.4% in 2017. But in 1997, 1998, and 1999, the GDP, the gross domestic product, grew 4.5%, 4.5%, and 4.7% respectively. Yet even that period paled in comparison against the 1950s and 1960s. Growth between 1962 and 1966 ranged from 4.4% to 6.6%. In post-war 1950 and 1951, it was 8.7% and 8% respectively. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate reached a low of 3.5% under Trump, but it dipped as low as 2.5% in 1953. After the pandemic tanked the economy, Trump has jacked up his claim even more, falsely saying it had been the greatest economy in the history of the world. Next, Trump stated, Washington insiders asked me not to stand up to China. They pleaded with me to let China continue stealing our jobs, ripping us off, and robbing our country blind. But I kept my word to the American people. We took the toughest, boldest, strongest, and hardest hitting action against China in American history, end quote. Response. Many economists say Trump's trade war with China has made matters worse for American farmers and exporters. First, Trump imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods from China. complaining that Asia's largest economy had been gaming global trade rules and manipulating its currency for years. In retaliation, China reduced purchases of U.S. crops such as soybeans. Then Trump directed subsidies to American farmers to soften the blow. Studies by leading economists have shown that the cost of Trump's China tariffs is largely borne by American consumers because companies pass down the costs. The two countries eventually resolved some sticking points in the first phase of a trade deal that took effect in January. But China is lagging far behind in its commitment to purchase $200 billion in agricultural, manufactured, and energy products above 2017 levels. Yet Trump deceptively claims they are, quote, more than living up to their commitments under the deal. We also pass, end quote. Next, Trump says, we also pass for VA accountability and VA choice. VA accountability and VA choice. We're taking care of our veterans. Response. Actually, Obama signed VA choice into law in 2014. Trump merely signed an update of the law known as the Mission Act, which went into effect in 2019. The Department of Veteran Affairs Accountability and Whistleblower Protection Act of 2017 was an important measure for accountability and whistleblower protection at the VA. But this law builds on firing authority given to VA Secretary through the Choice, Accountability and Transparency Act of 2014, signed by Obama. Trump frequently claims that before the law, no one could be fired, but the agency fired about 2,000 people a year before the law was enacted. The baseline rate of firing in VA before the law was about 220 people a month. And under Trump, it has increased to about 290 people a month. Trump said, we passed the decades-long awaited right to try legislation. Response. Trump signed right to try legislation in May 2018, allowing people with life-threatening illnesses to bypass the Food and Drug Administration to obtain experimental medication. But the legislation had not been waiting in the wings for decades, as Trump frequently claims. He has repeated the statement more than 45 times, according to our ongoing database. The idea first emerged less than a decade ago in 2013. Moreover, the FDA already approved 99% of requests for access to unapproved drugs, but supporters thought these policies were too restrictive. Contrary to Trump's claims of lives being saved, Allison Bateman House, a medical ethicist at the New York University School of Medicine, has tracked the law's application and estimates that fewer than 10 people have used it to get treatments since it was passed. Next, Trump said, we passed record-setting tax and regulation cuts at a rate nobody had ever seen before. Response. Trump's tax cut was not record-setting, despite the more than 200 times he has claimed otherwise, amounting to nearly 0.9% of the gross domestic product. It is far smaller than President Ronald Reagan's tax cut in 1981, which was 2.89% of the GDP. Overall, it is the 8th largest, even smaller than two passed under Barack Obama. Interesting. Trump may be closer to the facts when it comes to regulation cuts, but his claim cannot be easily verified. There is no reliable metric on which to judge his claim or to compare him to previous presidents. Many experts say the most significant regulations in U.S. history were the deregulation of airline and trucking industries during the Carter administration. Next, Trump stated, as part of Republican tax cuts, in 2019 alone, our child tax credit put over $2,000 into the pockets of 40 million American families. Actually, this was a statement made by Ivanka Trump, his daughter, in her statement. We are finished with Trump's statements now. The last few are some of the other major presenters during the Republican administration. We're winding down now. We just have a few to go. This was from Ivanka Trump in her speech. Again, as part of Republican tax cuts in 2019 alone, our child tax credit put over $2,000 into the pockets of 40 million American families. The truth is, Trump gives too much credit to her father and his Republican colleagues. The child tax credit has existed since 1997, and it's been expanded since then, including in the recent tax law. In 2016, under Obama, 35 million American families took the tax credit with an average benefit of over $1,500 a year, according to the Treasury Department. So there's only been a modest increase, in part because of inflation. Former New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said this in his speech. And although an agreement on action against police brutality would be very valuable for the country, it would also make President Trump appear to be an effective leader. They could have none of that. So Black Lives Matter and Antifa sprang into action, and in a flash, they hijacked the peaceful protests into vicious, brutal riots, end quote. Response: it is impossible to account for the beliefs and motives of every person at every protest, and consequently impossible to say that no one with Antifa beliefs was involved in any violence at the protests following the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis police custody in May. The likelihood that Antifa activists were involved with an organized conspiracy to hurt the president is another story. So Giuliani makes assertions here for which there is little evidence. Antifa is a moniker, not a single group, with a clear organizational structure or leader. It is a decentralized network of activists who don't coordinate and consequently did not conspire with anyone on any kind of scale, including Black Lives Matter, as Giuliani suggests. In recent years, Antifa activists appeared wherever there was a large gathering of white nationalists. And white nationalists are counterintuitive as it might seem, as counterintuitive as it might seem, have been known to attend Black Lives Matter rallies. Let me repeat that, because this is a very important point that I have pointed out with evidence, with documented evidence, with a photo and video imagery. White nationalists, as counterintuitive as it might seem, have been known to attend Black Lives Matter rallies. That is what could then draw attention from Antifa forces, according to Seth G. Jones, director of the Transnational Threats Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Both white nationalists and people who identify as Antifa were spotted at Floyd protests. Still, being present at and orchestrating violence are not the same. Jones reviewed protests in more than 140 cities throughout the month of June and spoke with U.S. officials within the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Most of the violence, Jones said, was committed by local hooligans, sometimes gangs, sometimes just individuals that are trying to take advantage of an opportunity. Also, let me say in parentheses, parenthetically, also by elements of these provocateur elements that insert themselves into the mix, and also, quiet as it's kept, police officers. They have also commit some of the destructive mayhem, knowing that the responsibility would be laid at the feet of the, quote, protesters. Continuing, officials have arrested more than 14,000 people across 49 cities. This is a very important point. Nationwide from May 27th to June 22nd. According to a Washington Post tally of data provided by police departments and included in media reports. Thousands were arrested for low-level offenses, including curfew violations and failure to disperse. Roughly 80 federal charges filed by June 22nd, including murder and throwing Molotov cocktails at police vehicles, reveal no evidence of an Antifa plot. 4 people who identify with the far-right extremist Boogaloo movements are among those facing the most serious federal charges. These are supporters of Trump and company. Asked whether anyone who identifies as Antifa had been charged, Justice Department spokesman Matt Lloyd said via email, quote, "We do not collect statistics based on potential inspiration, but on unlawful acts according to statute," end quote. Next, Senator Tom Cotton said Joe Biden sent pallets of cash to the Ayatollahs. President Trump ripped up the dangerous Iran nuclear deal. Response: that pallets of cash, quote unquote, was related to the settlement of a decades-old claim between the two countries, not the Iran nuclear deal. An initial payment of $400 million was handed over on January 17, 2016, the day after Iran released 4 American detainees, including the Washington Post's Jason Rezaian. The timing, which U.S. officials insisted was a coincidence, suggested the cash could be viewed as a ransom payment. But the initial cash payment was Iran's money. It was Iran's money. In the 1970s, the then pro-Western Iranian government under the Shah had paid $400 million for U.S. military equipment. But the equipment was never delivered because the two countries broke off relations after the seizure of American hostages and the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. 2 other payments totaling $1.3 billion, a negotiated agreement on the interest owed on the $400 million came some weeks later. State Department officials said the negotiations over the claims and detainees were not connected but came together at the same time, with the cash payment used as leverage to ensure the release of the detainees. Obama administration officials claimed that without a deal with Iran, the Hague Tribunal might have imposed an even higher interest penalty on the United States. Experts agree that was likely. U.S. officials said the transfer was made in cash rather than by wire, as previous claims reached through the Hague Tribunal were paid to ease the impact of increasingly tough sanctions imposed on Iran. Next, Cotton said Joe Biden let ISIS terrorists rampage across the Middle East. President Trump eliminated ISIS's leader and destroyed its caliphate. I despise that term, caliphate, attached to this group. The response: the caliphate built by the Islamic State, another term I despise, has been dismantled. But Trump cannot take all of the credit for its demise. Obama set up virtually all the structures that did the key fighting against the Islamic State under Trump, and more fighters were trained and munitions dropped under Obama than under Trump. Under Obama, all Iraqi cities, with the exception of the western half of Mosul, held by the Islamic State, such as eastern Mosul, Fallujah, Ramadi, and Tikrit, were retaken by the end of his term, as was much of the northeastern strip of Syria along the Turkish border. The basic plan of attack in 2017 was also developed under Obama, though Trump sped up the tempo by changing the rules of engagement. Moreover, the loss of physical territory does not mean the group is defeated. Reports estimate that 20,000 to 30,000 Islamic State militants may remain in Iraq and Syria, as opposed to 700 when the United States last withdrew. U.S. Central Command warns absent sustained counterterrorism pressure, ISIS could likely resurge in Syria within 6 to 12 months and regain limited territory, end quote. Thus, while the caliphate has been eliminated, the Islamic State remains a threat. In August 2019, the Defense Department Inspector General warned, quote, despite losing its territorial caliphate, the Islamic State solidified its insurgent capabilities in Iraq and was resurging in Syria. The reduction of U.S. forces has decreased the support available for Syrian partner forces at a time when their forces need more training and equipping to respond to the ISIS resurgence, end quote. In other words, the Islamic State's loss of territory does not mean the organization's end. Next, Cotton stated, Barack Obama's own Secretary of Defense said Joe Biden has been wrong on nearly every major national security decision over the past 4 decades. I really love this quote. I really love this this attack on Biden by Cotton and Trump and others, because it's very revealing. Well, anyway, let me stop. The response. Cotton was referring to a famous quote by Robert Gates, a Republican who served as defense secretary under George W. Bush and Obama. In his 2014 memoir, Gates wrote, quote, I think he has been wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. I recently heard Trump cite that quote. Oh, again, let me continue. SubhanAllah, this really gets at me because, and I'll just end my parenthetical comment on this with this. Every foreign policy initiative that Senator Joseph Biden pushed as a senior U.S. Senator in the U.S. Senate was in lockstep with some of the most hardcore Democrats and Republicans. He was in lockstep with them on these foreign policy issues. And so the criticisms that they're making on Biden, his major foreign policy failures, where he was wrong, they were wrong as well. Getting back to and we're almost finished, getting back to this critique. The Post says, but in a June interview with NPR, Gates indicated he supported Biden for president. What I will say is I wrote in my book, Duty, in 2014, that I thought Joe Biden had been wrong on almost every major foreign policy issue over the preceding 40 years. I wrote on the same page, though, that I regarded Joe Biden as a man of great integrity, a very decent human being, as somebody that if you had a personal problem or an issue, Joe Biden would be there to help you. So although I've got a lot of policy disagreements with the former vice president, he is a decent person. I think that what the country needs is somebody who will try to bring us together, end quote. Dana White, they were pulling from all kinds of areas for their Republican convention. Dana White, the president of the Ultimate Fighting Championship Network, said, quote, no one person in no one place could have anticipated the challenges that COVID would bring. The response, the risks of a global pandemic have long been predicted by health experts, and the Trump administration arguably reduced the ability of the United States to respond effectively to the outbreak. In fact, on October 25th, weeks before the first signs of the novel coronavirus, Biden tweeted, quote, we are not prepared for a pandemic. Trump has rolled back progress President Obama and I made to strengthen global health security. We need leadership that builds public trust, focuses on real threats, and mobilizes the world to stop outbreaks before they reach our shores, end quote. By contrast, on January 22nd, shortly after the first case was detected in the United States, Trump was asked in an interview about the coronavirus and he dismissed it. Quote, "We have it totally under control. It's one person coming in from China and we have it under control," he said. For weeks afterward, he also played down the threat of the virus to the United States. It has been widely documented that the administration bungled the rollout of testing for the novel coronavirus. The president spent nearly 2 months issuing confusing and contradictory signals, leaving the bureaucratic machine of the US government to chart the course for the pandemic response. The Centers for Disease Control and Protection designed its own tests. The Food and Drug Administration picked a conservative testing strategy, allowing labs to use only the CDC tests. When those tests turned up flawed, neither a new strategy nor a new test was available for more than 2 weeks. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar failed to push the agencies to change direction, and the president didn't intervene. The missteps that went unmanaged were ignored by leaders at the highest level of the government and allowed cases to go undetected, contributing to the spike in the virus's spread. And right now, we're close to 200,000 deaths from COVID-19 in the United States. Democrats want to tell you even how many hamburgers you can eat. This is getting ridiculous. This is from Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. That was one of his remarks in his speech. McConnell sounds like former White House advisor Sebastian Gorka, who told this conservative political action committee in 2019, quote, "They want to take your pickup truck. They want to rebuild your home. They want to take away your hamburgers," end quote. Gorka was referring to the Green New Deal, a non-binding resolution from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a Democrat from New York, and other Democrats that calls for cutting carbon emissions to net zero over 10 years while making steep investments in green infrastructure. Trump falsely said in 2019 that under the terms of the non-binding resolution, quote, "You're not going to own cows anymore." McConnell probably was referring to the Green New Deal in his remarks too, but it would not ban hamburgers. As we found last year, a fact sheet from Ocasio-Cortez's office said the plan called for a 10-year timeline because, quote, "We aren't sure that we'll be able to fully get rid of farting cows in airplanes that fast," end quote. Banning cows in airplanes was never in the resolution itself, and Ocasio-Cortez retracted the fact sheet and disowned the remarks within days. In fact, the resolution calls for the government to work collaboratively with ranchers to reduce pollution and greenhouse gas emissions as much as is technologically feasible, end quote. Now, brothers and sisters, we're at the end of these references from the convention, these direct quotes from the convention. I want to simply say in conclusion that Muslims are in a unique position, in a very unique position to help this country if this country is to be helped. I'm reminded of something that former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark said here in the Washington, D.C. area, in Silver Spring, Maryland. If I remember correctly, it was in Silver Spring, Maryland at a masjid there where it was a forum that we had put together. And he addressed a large audience that packed that space in the community center. And he said toward the end of his speech, "I hope the Muslims of this country will help this country. And the best way you possibly can is by standing up for Islam. Islam is the best chance the poor of the planet have for any hope of decency in their lives. It is the one revolutionary force that truly cares about humanity. This is what this former U.S. Attorney General, this elder sage, who has been all over the world, who has seen a lot, what he had to say about the potential impact of Muslims. We are at a point where Brother Imam, Dr. Abdullah Hakim Quick, he said, is a and we're at an opportunity for a reset. We all need to take advantage of this opportunity. And to my Muslim community, those of us who are the recipients of the final revelation from the one who created us all, we have a special obligation on our shoulders. As the recipients of this final revelation, we are in a unique position, both here in America and abroad. Let's not blow it. Inshallah ta'ala, we're going to continue this conversation. I want to thank my brother for staying with us and allowing us to go over the time allotted. And I want to thank those of you who were with us for this whole space of time. And I want to ask you to please share this with as many people as you possibly can, so that we can have some very critical thought, some critical discussion and debate around these issues that are challenging us all here in this country and abroad. With that said, subhanaka Allahumma wa bihamdika la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Peace be unto you. Assalamu alaikum.